So I think it's fair to say at the start of this project, the core team felt that probably we would need to be producing a business case to help explain why data standards were important. But what was really interesting and quite reassuring is that through discovery, it also emerged as something that all of the participating local authorities thought was important too. So we kind of upped the ante a bit on it in terms of saying, okay, how do we pull together a compelling financial case for data standards? I came up with a kind of an initial take on, if we were looking at a service end to end, what might be some of the costs, the avoidable costs, some of the pain points. And I shared that template with the 5 participating local authorities, asked for them to submit any data that they could, and from that I've been able to build up a kind of version of the business case using real data. But in terms of what I sent out, and I will just whiz through this, but I was very keen to think about the kind of the end-to-end service. And when we were going around during discovery, it became clear that most local authorities don't actually think about the full cost of a service. Often, the people answering the phones are paid for out of one budget, and the people collecting the bins are paid for out of another one. And it's quite hard to stitch together that end-to-end view. So, as a former sort of service manager, I was quite keen to try and get that thinking into this project. And I thought, well, probably, based on our discovery conversations, the costs are going to come from these sorts of areas. And again, apologies, it's a bit small from the back, but I'll shout them out, and there's a chance to go into it in more detail later. We got the sense there was quite a lot of cost in the kind of tendering and negotiating new contracts area, including actually preparing data for a new contract. There were some costs in the digital front end, so building and implementing great online content and interactive tools to help people to self-serve online. And there were some costs, a lot of costs probably around integrating systems when a new supplier comes on. So these were the sort of the one-off setup costs that local authorities were probably going to be dealing with. That's what we felt from discovery. And then once the service is up and running, there are kind of 3 main areas that I was interested in. So the cost of customer contact, which is actually very hard to say. Both in terms of offering and maintaining a good online offer, but also, more importantly, the cost of answering those phones. And that leading to some costs around kind of investigating and processing those inquiries. So we heard a lot in our discovery discussions about people having to look things up in multiple systems. In some cases, there were paper logs being handed over at the end of the day to the waste services team. There was quite a lot of inefficiency in how particularly missed bins were being investigated. And then finally, I assumed there'd be some costs around then following up. If actually it was a genuine missed collection, that probably there would be some costs associated with rescheduling the team to go pick it up. There might be some fuel costs and so on, and possibly actually some complaints from residents who didn't agree with the outcome. And I should mention that at the beginning, I wanted to put the call out for data for kind of 3 main areas. The costs associated with alleged missed bins, because that was our top priority area that people had identified. I also asked about the costs associated with people ordering new containers, because often that involves them transacting and spending money, and that felt like a whole lot of systems we might be interested in. And I also asked about the costs associated with reporting to DEFRA and others. But actually, the strongest data came back around missed collections. So I've used that as very much the core of what I've done, and then kind of extrapolated out from missed collections, how would that look then for other waste services, and I even did a crazy, and what would that look like for all digital services, all local services, to get some really big numbers. But this was my sort of starting template, and as some of you in the room will know, I sent out some lovely colour-coded spreadsheets asking for information around these different areas. And the reason I've shown those is that I was really keen for this to be based on the end-to-end service. And these are questions in plain English about how many calls do you get, and who answers them, and what do they do next, and how many steps are there. And it's really trying to get into that very kind of human-centered view of the service, so we can fully understand the cost of running it and where data standards might help. So out it went, and some of you in the room very kindly submitted data back, and I also was able to get hold of data from a few other local authorities as well. But it was hard to get that end-to-end picture from any one organisation, and it might be that I put the wrong bits in the puzzle, so that's something we can talk about later. But the good news was there were enough pieces from across the different authorities for me to piece it together. And really encouragingly, there were some kind of similarities and trends that emerged. So something I spotted, for example, is that on average, it seems that each household has 0.05 miss bin contacts with the council every year. But that allowed me to, the rate is 0.05 contacts per household for missed bins. And a slightly different one for all waste. And so that helped me build the model. And similarly, it felt like, on average, councils were spending up to about £10,000 on preparing their data and cleaning it up every time they implemented a new service. So there were various things like that that reassured me that even though I didn't have much data to play with, there were some commonalities that gave me confidence to put together the numbers. And another thing that really struck me was that although the waste contracts are often very long, and it might feel to some of you in the room like this is something we're not going to be even talking about for another 6 years, if you look nationally, if on average every council is going through this every 7 years, that's 50 councils every year going through the re-implementation of a contract, and that is quite significant. And when you add up some of those costs, it's a really big number. So for those of us in the room who are interested in like the national picture, that was something that really struck me, and that fed into the model quite strongly. So I'm going to show you some numbers. In the interest of time, I'm going to rattle through them, but if you're interested in digging into this in more detail, I would love to hear from you after the break. So this is the picture I was able to build up in terms of the setup costs. So some costs around the data elements of the tendering process. I estimate that, and I don't think I'm going to read out all these numbers actually. I think I'm just going to put them up on the screen and point to the big areas. So we broke it down into costs around tendering and contract negotiation that could potentially be addressed with data standards, cleaning and prepping the data at the start of a new contract, integrating systems, so integrating your new supplier system with your CRM, with your payment system, whatever it might be, and the digital front-end costs, setting up those new online forms or tools. And then in terms of running costs, the cost of answering those phone calls, and of keeping your online offer up to date, particularly if policy changes or if it's extreme weather. There is an ongoing cost of making sure your digital offer is accurate and up to date. Some costs around investigating and processing. And then the resolution of calls was hard to, people found it hard to extract that when I was saying, well, how much do you think you spend on fuel sending trucks back to addresses that were missed the day before? And it was very hard for people to extract that from the overall costs of their contract. It didn't seem to be something that people broke out, which is fair enough. I just put it in there as a punt. There may be a better way of getting to that. So the things I would just point out quickly is that the big numbers for tend to be around the cost of investigating and processing. So this is for all waste calls. But I think there's a real hidden cost, I feel, generally in services, not just local government services. People know how much it costs to answer the phone, but very rarely have they actually then walked through, hang on a minute, who has to talk to who and look in what system and double check with who and log into what and da-da-da-da-da-da. And if you actually even take some quite conservative estimates of the number of minutes per day that people are spending on each of those, it adds up quite fast. And this is an area that data standards can really help us with, to join things up and get rid of some of those manual steps. And also the cost of integration, new systems talking to each other at the start of a contract, that's another area where I think there's quite a big saving to be made. And I suspect on the digital front end, although ironically it's the area I kind of know the most about from previous jobs, I may have overestimated the costs of implementing good online services, but it was based on quite reliable data from 2 councils. But I'd be really interested in anyone in the room with expertise in that, kind of giving that the once over. So I appreciate this is sort of hitting with lots of numbers, but the main point is that end-to-end view of the service and where might data standards help reduce costs. And if you look at the picture nationally, the numbers get really quite big. So potentially we could be saving nearly 90 million quid across the country every year if we weren't looking things up manually and systems weren't crashing and not talking to each other and so on. There's some big numbers here. And there's a really big number that we banded around, for those of you that are eagle-eyed, in terms of like £650 million of savings to the sector over 7 years. And that's based on this really interesting thing that every year, on average, 50 councils are going through a tendering process. And so if each of those, if you could wave a magic wand and each of those were able to switch to this sort of improved world where the standard is helping things to flow, then if 50 moved over every year for 7 years, that's where that big number comes from. But one of the things I recognised in the model, and which again we can talk about later, is that of course the early adopters, I thought maybe the first 20 councils they're not going to see those benefits straight away, because they're the ones having to do a lot of the heavy lifting and to kind of prove it for everybody else. So I've suggested that actually the first 20 councils that go through this might not realise all the savings, and maybe that's an area that central government can help with. So this is me as an independent person saying, hey, if there was some money to help make this happen, these are some of the ways you could invest in this to make it happen. So Linda alluded to the future of if there is going to be a standard, who's going to maintain and develop it. You know, somebody who could maybe move around the country and work with different councils as they go through implementation. Maybe a central body could subsidise the cleaning up of data, so that 10k per council that goes into cleaning and prepping your data in order to use the standard and benefit from it. That could be an incentive that could be offered. And finally, potentially helping the first X councils, I said 20 in the model, just to have a number in there, helping them by subsidising some of the implementation costs for the first that go through. Maybe that's a way that some central fund could pay for some of this. So those were just some ideas of, like, you know, we recognise this isn't going to happen for free, so where might the incentives come from? And in terms of what's next, so I think I'm quite keen to separate out the sort of the approach and the model. Is that helpful? And then the data that's currently in it, is that right? Some of those numbers might not be right, but until I've got people telling me that and sharing their data with me, it's very hard for me to gauge. There are some gaps in it. Can we plug those in the coming weeks for our beta version? Also, the costs and savings for suppliers are currently absent. I did ask around and try and get some hard data. It was quite hard to come by. So, you know, I think there's savings on the commercial side as well. And yeah, basically, if you're interested in this aspect of the project, do come to my breakout group later, and we can look at some spreadsheets and get excited about the numbers. At least they're coloured spreadsheets. So yeah, that's where we've got to with the business case work.